Good afternoon, everyone. Today is a very solemn but a very important day. As an elected official, we all have the privilege and the responsibility to speak on behalf of the community and raise attention to critical issues. Fighting anti-Semitism is an important issue in Monroe and throughout the world. This has been a very personal and emotional dynamic in my life. When I was young, I used to watch a program called The World at War. It was a black and white television program, I believe it was on Channel 9. And as a youngster, when they showed the Holocaust, I went running to my parents. And it just touched me to the point where I said, how could people act like that? And that stuck with me through my entire life. My education as an undergrad, I got my degree in history. I take history very sacred. And for me, we all need to learn about the past to deal with the contemporary issues like anti-Semitism. One of the first things I did when I was sworn in as mayor was join the Mayors United Against Anti-Semitism because I knew anti-Semitism and hate still exists today, and we must speak at every opportunity that we can get. I'd like to read the official pledge that I took. This is from the Mayors United Against Anti-Semitism. It's an initiative of American Jewish Committee and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. 5 years ago, U.S. mayors from all 50 states issued a call to action to combat anti-Semitism in Europe. Not alone in their concern, the mayors from across Europe joined in the fight with the United States mayors and signed onto the pledge. And so we gather as leaders of our cities and communities to jointly say one simple word: enough. I took the pledge. We, the undersigned mayors, express our deep conviction that anti-Semitism is not only an attack on Jews, but an assault on the core values of the democratic and pluralistic society in which we live. In a world of global communications where anti-Semitic ideas spread rapidly, a concerted and principled response is required to raise awareness, to educate, and to ensure decency prevails. As mayors and municipal leaders, we have a unique responsibility to speak out against the growing menace of anti-Semitism by affirming the following. We, the undersigned, condemn anti-Semitism in all forms, including hatred and prejudice directed toward Jews, stereotypes and conspiracy theories about Jews, Holocaust deniers or distortion and denying the Jewish people's right to self-determination and or the Jewish state's right to exist. Support national, state, and local government efforts directed at eradicating anti-Semitism and preventing extremist indoctrination and recruitment, and support expanded education programs, including Holocaust programs, to counter intolerance and discrimination. Reject the notion that opinions about the policies, actions, or resistance of the State of Israel can ever be justified or excused anti-Semitic acts. Affirm that a climate of mutual understanding and respect among all citizens is the bedrock of pluralistic communities. We therefore commit to working within and across our communities to advance the values of respectful coexistence. We call upon mayors, municipal leaders, and other elected officials in the United States and around the world, and all people of good faith to join in declaring unequivocally that anti-Semitism is incompatible with fundamental democratic values. So again, I talked about today as a somber day, but a day of great importance, where we grieve 6 million Jews and other innocent lives lost in the Holocaust, but we must remember. I would certainly like to thank Eileen Lerner from the Human Relations Committee and all the commission members here for helping to put this event together. I certainly want to recognize Miriam Cohen, our council president, who was a leader in speaking out against anti-Semitism and hate and reminding us why this is so important. Our other council members here, Rupa Siegel and Charles DePiro as well. I want to acknowledge and recognize and thank the rabbi who is here today, as well as our guest speakers. It is a privilege to be here and hear from these individuals. And I just want to thank you. It is an honor and a privilege. And I always will have in my heart that one word, enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor. So good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, we talked about the cell phones. I would like to thank everyone for being here on this very important Holocaust Remembrance Day. My name is Eileen Lerner, and I am on the Human Relations Commission of Monroe Township. We are sponsoring today's program. I am also the owner of a home health care agency for Holocaust survivors. I've been doing this now for 30 years. I work with the thank you. I work with the nonprofit agency Jewish Family Services in Monroe Township on their Holocaust Survivor Assistance Program. And I would like to thank the Holocaust survivors for coming out today. They are seated all in the front. With the Holocaust survivors, please stand if you can. If you cannot, please raise your hand. Can you all raise your hand, Holocaust survivors? Thank you, Lois Flamehold. And Ruth Leibowitz. Please give them a hand. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank Jewish Family Services representatives for being here today. Faye Ross and Ronnie Salkin. Today we will be hearing from Rabbi Shmuel Pollan of Congregation Etz Chaim in Monroe Township. He is a scholar on the Holocaust. We will also be hearing from Holocaust survivor Paul Bella, who resides in Monroe Township. And we will have a poem read by Liz Rothman of the Holocaust Speakers Organization, Henry Rickless.
I just want to add, we have two more survivors. Ellie, stand. Claire, stand.
Thank you for coming today. I would now like to bring up Rabbi Shmuel Pollan.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be sharing a little bit about my scholarship and motivation and what has interested me so much in the Holocaust a little bit here today. Today marks Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Our hearts still ache, the victims still near to our hearts. Today we remember mothers, fathers, grandparents, and children, all stolen, leaving a void in our consciousness, a wound that will never heal. Yom HaShoah is a time and place of mourning for the Jewish communities across the globe. We mourn the loss of 6 million Jewish people callously stolen and annihilated simply for being Jews. It shrunk the global population of Jews to nearly down 35% subsequent to the war, and 1/3 of every Jew in the planet was annihilated and could not escape the Nazi regime with their lives. These were not just people, though. They were mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, family. They included victims and survivors, and they included many of my own nuclear family. Growing up in New Jersey, my grandfather would tell me stories of survival from when he was in a camp during the war, and it profoundly impacted my Jewish identity. prior to being captured by the Nazis, he was offered papers that would classify him as a non-Jew and therefore protect him. And his words then were, "I was born a Jew and I will die a Jew." Growing up in the shelter of American freedom here in New Jersey, I would frequently ponder, given the religious freedom of this country that we've been guaranteed, and thought, have I any excuse not to embrace my own Jewish identity here? My generation faces a hostile world of anti-Semitism and ignorance before us, and it is up to us to step up to the plate and assume the roles of educators against ignorance and hatred. So, hineni, in Hebrew, as we say, here I am, and it was this motivation that beckoned my pursuit of Holocaust and genocide studies and scholarship that began first at American University in Washington, D.C., then Gratz College in Melrose Park, Pennsylvania, and eventually into the rabbinate at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Paired with these focuses was a deep passion for woodworking, art, and film that equally affirmed Jewish survival, transcending generations from my grandfather to then his son, and then to myself. Naturally, at Gratz College, my academic focus landed on the intersection of artistic cinema as a conduit for confronting anti-Semitism during the height of fascism during the 1930s. While at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, my capstone thesis focused and included further scholarship on the majestic Torah arts of Eastern Europe and culminated in a series of museum-driven publications that circulated across Poland. For both sets of academic studies, I've always seen art as a lens through which I see this world. It is empowering, and it has been the primary focus of much of my scholarship in Holocaust and genocide studies. Its form is naturally subversive and analytical. It is a commentary, and it has been used by our people to overthrow dictators, to challenge anti-Semitism, and to wage a war against Hitler. It ushered in new eras that have been the constant pulse of the people and for the people. It is a natural democratic voice in which all can participate in regardless of background, natural origin, or religion. Art has the ability to create equality, and it sounds the eternal voice of our people. Yes. I'm very tall. I apologize for this. Can't hear me, but I can pull it out. I'm 6 feet tall. Okay. Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. And it is a naturally liberating force. Prescient to illustrate this was just a few weeks ago we celebrated Pesach, Passover, and I brought to our community a new Passover Haggadah, illustrated by someone named Arthur Szyk. Arthur Szyk championed the art, the subversive art, with a brushstroke to offer political, social, and religious commentaries throughout the 1920s until the 1940s. And his Passover Haggadah satirized Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito, and it took swipes at classical Jewish establishment norms. His Haggadah included Miriam's cup, and his artwork commented on the women's suffrage movement in America. A Polish-born Jew, Żyk's artwork defines a subversive culture against fascism, Bolshevism, and his art form laid the groundwork for political satires that would characterize Mad Magazine's political commentaries in the decades to come. But brushstrokes are not the only way to empower the powerless during the Nazi era. No greater force could dominate the hearts and souls of the masses in the 20th century other than film. So consider the talent that goes into every film production. From writers to cinematographers and actors, the industry has historically had a heavy Jewish presence. Edgy commentaries during the 1930s and the 1940s particularly spoke to a moment of immense powerlessness in our history. Scripts like The Mad Dog of Europe, To Be or Not to Be, Mortal Storm, The Great Dictator, and even the Three Stooges shorts that You Nazi Spy and I'll Never Hail Again all swiped dictators and demigods naked. They commentaried and offered commentary that was not only subversive because they castigated Germany as the enemy, but also because it was coming from America during an era of political censorship, felt during primarily the Breen and Hayes era of the motion picture industry. Some films were simply too edgy for their time. For instance, It Can't Happen Here, a theatrical adaptation of Sinclair Lewis's book, was so heavily censored that it could only be recently picked up by production studios. A great tragic irony is that one set of catastrophes, the Holocaust, nearly wiped out one art form known as Jewish woodworking. but it was being revived once again as a result of another catastrophe felt during COVID-19. During my time at Union College Jewish Institute of Religion's rabbinical program, I embarked upon the Opening the Ark project, which set about to reconstruct one of the lost Torah arks, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, here in America. And the reconstructed ark was among the jewels of European Jewry. Towering and coated in vibrant colors, it stood in Sidra, Poland, but it was destroyed by the Nazis in 1942. With Polish, Sephardic, Ashkenazi, and Russian influences, it demonstrated a Jewish dialogue and masterfully of artistry and carpentry. The project responded to some of the dilemmas affecting Jewish life in America today and redefined how many choose to engage with Judaism and Holocaust education, which are so important to me. Nothing better encapsulated my imagination better than woodworking as a form of subversive art and narrative. Much of my scholarship particularly focused on this tradition, and prior to the Second World War, woodworking was a heavily Jewish craft. In Poland alone stood hundreds of wooden synagogues and Torah arks, but nearly all were annihilated after the war. Holocaust scholars may review a short list of only 2 or 3 wooden synagogues that survived from these wooden synagogues subsequent to the war. One made its way to Cincinnati, Ohio, and is part of the Skirball Museum. The other 2 today are located in Israel. And as part of my scholarship on Holocaust and genocide studies, I sought to identify the provenance of the only wooden ark in America and reconstruct an entire Torah ark from one of the perished wooden synagogues of Europe from Sidra, Poland. My scholarship of both provenance and reconstruction, however, was more complex than typical archival research. For most primary source research, one may rely upon archives of preserved museum collections. However, this course of study was more reminiscent of a forensic study, and the crime had been the Holocaust. In the case of the recovered Torah ark in Cincinnati, we had very little to work with to determine provenance. We knew not where it had come from. In the case of rebuilding the Torah ark, we had only one black and white image of what it had once looked like. Fortunately, the study was able to determine the provenance of the Torah ark from a small town known as Sri Lanka in Poland, and the publish of that research circulated in Poland and was welcomed in their museums. Yet at the same time, it revealed a question of ownership of rights and claim for a community that transcended even the Holocaust. As for the reconstruction of the Torah ark, that was a monumental project that sought to reconstruct one of the perished wooden synagogues that had been destroyed in the Holocaust from Sidra, Poland. And the ark has now been rebuilt and is standing, again, in the Skirball Museum of Cincinnati, as it was once one of the jewels of European Jewry. However, reviving the Torah ark and engaging in woodworking preserves the memory of tradition of Jewish craftspeople from the Holocaust, a craft that the Holocaust sought to destroy that lives on with us here today because we are part of that story. And the post-Holocaust narrative is now to shift from our destruction and moving to a rebirth as a result. That is where the project fits in. It was an enactment of the pervasive spiritual and artistic liberation of our people. If only for a while, it sought to redefine the Holocaust, and I will not let this art form die or its flame become extinguished under my watch. It will be passed on to another generation. Today we need art and Holocaust education more than ever before. And it may often feel like the will of the people has yet again, maybe once subdued away from Holocaust awareness and education, to which we must imagine from our collective consciousness, it can't happen here. But we know better. It can, and it can happen here. We've long battled tyranny and totalitarian regimes that have enacted many measures of political repression, and we need Holocaust education because it offers a stable voice in our unstable world. The voice of such a person who may carry a message such as Arthur Szyk during the war or after the Holocaust may be repressed. The floodgates may only delay the eventual outpour of the great masses of an ideal, of good over evil, of progress over delay, of love over hate, of all of our voices. The all-encompassing definition of the creative arts, stories, music, dance, painting, and woodworking, all encapsulating the Holocaust, will carry on our messages transcending generations and telling the story of the vitality of our people throughout the post-Holocaust era and into the future. And by preserving that, our future may be bright. Artistic and creative innovations will continue to propel our people and empower to liberate ourselves into the future. As Charlie Chaplin once said, the misery that is upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. But the hate of men will pass, and the power taken from the people will one day soon return to the people, and liberty will not perish. This message of liberation and empowerment has been the core to my rabbinate and to my scholarship. It is a story that began in my childhood and blossomed with my experiences and studies. And through the experiences of being a rabbi, it has come to fruition. Using Holocaust scholarship and art as a Jewish medium to reach into the future, let us all look up with optimism as we build a brighter tomorrow. Keni Hiratson, may it be God's will. Amen. In observance of our custom on Yom HaShoah, I'd like to ask everyone to please rise as we're going to be reciting the Mourner's Kaddish in the memory of the 6 million Jews who have perished as a result of the Shoah, the Holocaust. Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei Rabbah v'alma dibra hirutei v'yamlich ma'achutei v'chayekon u'v'yonechon u'fayei d'chol beis Yisrael Ba'agala Wizman Karid Imru Amen. Yahei Shmei Rabba Mivorach Le'olam Olamei Almaya Yisbarak V'yishtabach V'yispa'ar V'yisraman V'yisnasei V'yisadar V'yisaleh V'yisalal Shamei V'kudasha V'rehu Le'ela Minkol Birchata V'shirata Tushbechata V'nekamata Damran V'yama V'imru Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shamaya V'chaim aleinu v'al Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav. Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al Yisrael v'imru amen. May their memories always remain within us. And let us say, Amen. You may be seated.
Thank you, Rabbi. There is literature in the back of the room when you leave that the Rabbi has left, if you're interested in looking at it. I would now like to introduce Paul Bella. Give him a hand, please.
I just thought I'd introduce myself to begin with. Family-wise, I'm one of the real lucky guys that Hitler did not kill. I have a family including children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. We have 8 great-grandchildren. So Adolf didn't do so well. I live here in Monroe Township, and I'm a very lucky guy. I was able to leave Europe in 1939 when things were approaching the war, and I left Vienna just in time. I'm going to tell you the story about how I left Vienna and how a family saved 50 children. First, I'd like to introduce the sweet girl, which is my wife. Where's she sitting in the front row? Right over here, the lady. She's a lady in green and she looks good in all colors. We're married 66 years. The reason why I'm 91, it's all her fault. But getting to the actual subject at hand, I'd like to first start where I was born in Vienna in 1931, and a good time when people were living comfortable lives and not worried about the shadow of anti-Semitism, even though Vienna had plenty of anti-Semitism, and the Catholic Church in Vienna was supportive of a lot of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, it is a Catholic country. When I was born, my mother wanted to call me Eric, I was born in November of 31, but she thought it might be too German a name. Someday in the future, there might have to be a change in our venue where we live. So she wanted to give me a good Catholic name, so I wound up with Paul. And Paul worked out pretty good. They even named the Pope after me. So things worked out pretty well. And for a number of years, from 31 until March of 38, we lived a very good life. My family lived with 2 other members of the family and had a very successful plywood business. And as a result, we just prospered. We had the rights of all other citizens. Meanwhile, the Germans already had Adolf Hitler as of 32. And in 34, the Nuremberg laws. The Nuremberg laws basically said Jews are not citizens, they have no rights, they're enemies of the state, and they helped us lose the First World War. Even though many Jewish men went in to fight for the Germans in the First World War and died. But why should they tell the truth? That doesn't serve their purposes. So people in Vienna already knew there was a shadow hanging over Europe, and Hitler was getting more and more outspoken in his absolute hatred of Jews. The truth of the matter is, he who hates is his own worst enemy. He who hates hates himself. And Hitler was his own worst enemy right to his final days, as well as all the other Nazis. Now the situation in March of 38 was that the Germans took over Austria. They called it the Anschluss, the annexation. It was the beginning of the nightmare period and the beginning of the Holocaust. Jews no longer had any rights of citizenship. They couldn't work for the government. Many of their businesses, including our business, was taken over with no compensation. All of a sudden, a man who had a decent living and had a family had nothing. He was at home by himself. He wasn't really allowed to participate. He didn't even have a telephone. And his communications were being censored. He couldn't even do much to let other people know what was going on. The Jews no longer could go to the park. The only park was for Aryans. The truth of the matter is, the Germans were no Aryans. The Germans were mostly dark-haired, dark-eyed. When Hitler conquered the Scandinavian countries, he yelled out, "My God, they're really the Aryans." And he was right. There was nothing about Hitler or all the dark-eyed and dark-haired Nazis that had anything to do with pure Nazi. They were a mixture because they were in Central Europe. And of course, this old Aryan concept and clean was a total lie in every respect. So we couldn't go to the park because the park was only one park available where dogs could defecate and Jews could walk. That was their version of going to the park. You couldn't go to the same school anymore because the Nazis wanted pure schools. So we had to go to a school that was only Jewish. And in that school was a big picture of Hitler. And I asked my mother, what does he represent? My mother said, oh, he's the head of the country. And every school has a picture of the head of the country. She couldn't tell me for real what he represented. There was a documentary made of how the 50 children, including myself, were saved from Vienna. And I'm going to go into that discussion now because the only way to get out of Vienna was to get an affidavit, to get a visa, and to have somebody sponsor you. And if you didn't have somebody to sponsor you, you will probably wind up in the death camps, as I will show you very clearly. What happened then was a couple from Philadelphia named Krause, Mr. and Mrs. Krause, wanted to save 50 children if they could get the affidavits. It took them a long time. The documentary shows they had to go to a lot of families and ask them if they were willing to sponsor a child in Philadelphia, mostly Jewish families. And they had an organization, a Jewish organization, with Shalom, which also sponsored getting as many people who were willing to support a Jewish child. Finally, they got to 50. Took a lot of doing. It wasn't easy, and they themselves were also sponsoring 2 children. When that happened, they went to Vienna to see if they could obtain the release of 50 children. Now, they themselves had their own children living in Philadelphia. They had a lot at stake by going to a Nazi country and trying to rescue children. They might as well give up their lives if the Nazis decided, you're not coming out. And the documentary shows them arriving first in Austria's neighboring cities, where Hitler was already speaking in vicious terms, because he was born in Austria, Mr. Hitler was, and already speaking about all the viciousness and all the hatred that he expected the Germans to follow, and everybody made Heil Hitler. Then their train took them to Vienna. There they had a doctor along with them because he was going to be examining the children. It turned out 25 boys and 25 girls were going to be selected. When they came to the children, they wanted to know, would you be willing to travel without your parents? They didn't tell them that they may never see their parents again, because that would be far too traumatic. But they did say, would you be willing to travel alone to the United States? There's the mental side of the equation. Many children, of course, be scared to death. Where am I going? What's going on? I'm used to mommy and daddy. Mutti und Tati. So my mother told me, you're going to New York to visit some relatives in the Bronx. There were some relatives in the Bronx. They weren't affluent at all, and they were just there. They weren't there to meet me and take care of me, but there was some truth to it. I thought I was going on vacation. She didn't give me any information about how sad and how tragic and how miserable life really was, and how maybe we couldn't get out at all. When they interviewed me, as a kid, I was a wise guy. I used to kid around a lot and say things I wasn't supposed to say. And they offered me a chocolate. Pauli, which is my version of Paul. Pauli, would you like a piece of chocolate? And I asked my mother, is it okay if I take the chocolate? And they liked the fact that I was courteous enough to ask, not just to take. And later my mother said, Pauli, that's not you. You're a wise guy from the day one. And homie would have grabbed it and eaten it before I could say anything. And I said, yeah, I guess I said the right thing at the right time, which I did. I was one of those 25 boys selected. The age group was from about 6 to about 12. And there was one bar mitzvah boy, which I will tell you about in a minute, in a sad sort of way. When these children were selected, what was planned was that we would be taking a train to Berlin and then to Hamburg, where we would be leaving for New York by boat on the President Harding, which was the boat that was taking us by way of England to the New York harbor. This was in May of 1939, not too many months before the war broke out in September of 1939. Now, this family was willing to risk their own lives to save a life. It says in the Talmud, to save a life is to save the world. And that is the theme of what they were trying to do, to save a life. After the children were approved, one child got sick, and he couldn't go with the group. And they substituted another boy who turned out to be a friend of mine later on, and who also lived in this community, named Alfred Berg, who has since passed away. But the child that couldn't make it because of illness wound up in the death camp and died there. And that goes to show you that to save a life is to save the world. We took the train, and at the train station, leaving Vienna, We boarded the train and I had my little teddy bear, whose name was Otto. Otto liked me and I liked him. I especially liked him because it was an easy one to spell. He could go backwards on it. And I said, Otto, you're doing good. And he looked up at me and said, yeah, of course, I'm a good boy. And we waved from the train on the platform. The parents stood. And they were not allowed to wave goodbye because it might look like Heil Hitler. If a parent waved goodbye, they were immediately arrested. The Nazis had troops, police, Gestapo on the platform. We didn't know the difference. We thought maybe just that way. Then we arrived in Vienna, in Berlin, and then overnight in Hamburg, which is a port where the boats go. And we got on the boat. But before that, I wanted to give you a little background on Kristallnacht. In November of '38, when we were still living there, all of us, the Nazis committed the beginning of the worst of the Holocaust. A German official had been shot for some reason or other by a Jew, and that was reason for mass destruction of the Jewish population, because one person had been killed. They burned all the synagogues in Vienna. They destroyed many stores and looted them. They took a lot of Jews, just plain and simple, including one of my uncles, to the concentration camps. The concentration camps were not work camps. They always referred to them as work camps. But the truth of the matter is, there was nothing about them that was work camps. It was work till you die, or till you go to the gas chamber and the oven. That was the kind of work camps. Auschwitz has a sign, Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes you free, which is exactly the opposite of what Auschwitz was, which was a mass extermination camp, and nothing less. But the night of November of 1938, when all these activities were going on and the Holocaust was going full blast, they came up to our place in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock and they banged on the door and they came in and took all our valuables. They took silverware, they took paintings, they took rugs, they took anything that had any value at all, of course. They stole everything. My mother had taken a little jewelry and put it in a jar. And that jar had black powder in it and it was marked rat poison. So as a result, they left that jar alone. And later, when she did survive, she was able to take that jewelry with her that had been in that jar marked rat poison. Now, having survived that period, I'm now getting onto the boat. The boat is, of course, taking us to New York Harbor. I thought I'd tell you a few things that happened on the boat that were more on the humorous side. Not everything was ugly and horrendous. Sometimes it's a little laugh too, because life has that. I only spoke German on the boat, and they were serving different meals to the children. The first thing they put on my plate was, they called it a hot dog. In German, that would mean you took a dog and you baked it and then you served it. And I said to myself, holy mackerel, they actually eat dogs? And then one of them said, no, it's a Frankfurter. German word and an English word, a Frankfurter, and I knew what they were talking about. The second time, they put something in front of me that was red, and it was jumping back and forth. And it scared me. I figured it was going to attack me. And they said, no, it's just Jell-O. Good old cherry-flavored Jell-O. So I realized it was not going to attack me. And the last one has to do with the subject of ice cream. They put in front of me some nice-looking ice cream with lots of toppings of all kinds of good stuff on top of the ice cream. And they said, Paul, here's an ice cream sundae. And I said to myself, oh my God, it's Tuesday. By the time I get this thing, it's going to be completely melted. And they said, no, it's not the case. They just called it an ice cream sundae, but you eat it now. So that was another example of how the language can play tricks on you. Later, I did pick up the English language rather quickly. I was only 7.5 when I left. So as a result, when you're young, you usually don't have much of an accent left, and you can pick up the other languages, which I did. Arriving in the States at the same time, I was sent to a summer camp. A Jewish organization from Philadelphia had sponsored it. And the children were spending the summer of 1939 at a camp in Pennsylvania, in Collegeville, Pennsylvania, which is not too far from Philadelphia. Now, before I get into my American part, I just thought I'd mention what happened with my parents. My mother and my grandparents were trying very hard to get visas. I had one uncle in the States that came early, and he was trying in every way that he could to get us financial support so that we could get visas. And eventually he got it. And in February of 1940, when the war had already started, my parents were able to come from Vienna by way of Holland to New York to live in the United States. But my father was not one of them. My father was not an Austrian citizen. He was born in Poland and he had not become an Austrian citizen. If you were not an Austrian citizen, you were stateless. In German, staatslos, which means you were a first candidate for the death camps if you were stateless. And he knew that unless he did something quickly, he was dead. He went into the hospital to have his appendix taken out, even though he didn't need it. The Germans came into the hospital, and where is Mr. Bella? And they said, oh, he's recovering from surgery. Ah, very good. We'll take good care of him after that. You let us know when he is okay. Meanwhile, when he recovered immediately, he left the hospital and he got into a transport that took him to a part of Czechoslovakia that was not Nazi yet. There was a warehouse there for people who were trying to escape and needed some place to stay for the time being. Later, of course, the Nazis occupied everything, including Czechoslovakia and all the other countries. My father was sleeping on the floor in a warehouse with a lot of other Jews with things that my mother sent him, like bedding, food, clothing. He had nothing. And he lived in that warehouse for a little while. Meanwhile, there was a boat that was scheduled to leave on the Danube from that area which was supposed to take them to Palestine. Now, the Arabs were opposed to any Jews coming into Palestine, and the British didn't want to upset the Arabs. So when that boat left, it was leaving under very dangerous circumstances. On that boat, they ran out of food, they ran out of fuel, they were using furniture to burn instead of coal. My father worked in the kitchen but washing dishes in order that he could grab a little something to eat. And then when they finally arrived at the port in Palestine, they were diverted to a British island in the Indian Ocean, Mauritius. It's a small tropical island off the coast of Africa. Nowadays, it's just a tourist attraction. In those days, it was just a part of the British Empire, and it had malaria mosquitoes in all directions. And the boat docked there, and my father stayed there throughout the entire war because he couldn't go anywhere else. He was not a prisoner, but he was just a detainee. He had malaria 23 times, and he survived. He lived to 93. My mother was another survivor. She lived to 99. And with me being 91, maybe it's a good sign. You never can tell, maybe it's a good sign. But eventually, at the end of the war, he was able to go to Palestine for a short time and then traveled to the States. He arrived in July of 46. I hadn't seen my father from 39 to 46, 7 years. Wow. Now, meanwhile, myself, I was taken after the summer camp in 39 by a family, Mr. and Mrs. Amram. They were among the families that were willing to sponsor children. and take a child to live with for a period of time, maybe to adopt it if necessary. So I was taken at the end of the summer to Feasterville, Pennsylvania, a small town near Philadelphia. They had a farm and he was a lawyer who worked in Philadelphia, very successful. They wanted to help a child like me and to take care of the child. To save a life is to save the world. I spent a year with them. They took good care of me, treated me like a son. They also had a son of their own and a daughter. And they also had dogs. I became a dog lover. And I also enjoyed the farm environment. I learned how to plant vegetables. I learned how to fall off bikes. I learned how to fall off skating on ice. I learned a lot of stuff. And I also made a lot of mistakes. Just like we all do when we really don't know exactly what we're doing. I was a city boy. And all of a sudden, I was a farm boy. But they treated me wonderfully, with respect, with love. Aunt Emily and Uncle Philip was the name of the family is the Amrams. Philip Werner Amram and Emily Amram, which I owe respect to for the rest of my life. When I reached the point of completing my one school year there and beginning to learn the language, and I had a woman there that was a refugee that was helping me learn the language. Then I arrived back in New York with my mother and my grandparents. This was 1940. We got an apartment in Washington Heights, which is a place where a lot of refugees wound up, in the northern part of Manhattan on the Hudson side. We lived in an apartment not far from the George Washington Bridge. This was located on Fort Washington Avenue and 181st Street. And we were only too happy to have a place to live and to have a dumbwaiter to put the garbage in and to live a reasonably comfortable life in freedom with religion and public speaking and everything else the way it should be, not the way it was in Nazi Germany. Now, in this particular case, I myself was educated at the Stuyvesant High School in New York, which was one of the more upstanding scientific schools, City College of New York. I was in the Army for 2 years, from 54 to 56, during the Korean period. And then I did my graduate work at New York University. And I was fortunate enough to get the GI Bill of Rights. So you can say in that respect, it's mitmazel. I'm lucky that I escaped. I'm lucky that I go into City College, which didn't cost much. More lucky than anything else, I met the sweet girl, to which I'm married to for 66 years. And life in general has been sweet. I've also decided to give back to the community. I worked in Medicare and I worked in Social Security during my 40-year federal employment. My wife also worked for the same agency and did a wow job. She was something special. She started as a secretary and finished up in a very high-level job, to show you how smart she was. And to top it off, when it came to the higher grades, she broke the glass ceiling. No, women weren't being given that opportunity at the higher levels, and she was the first one to get that kind of a job. So I use that term, she broke the glass ceiling. I myself had a successful career, and after completing my career in September of '97, I wound up working as a volunteer Medicare counselor. I've done it now for over 20 years. I've saved a lot of people money because I was known as the appeals man, helping write appeals to Medicare for money. In some cases, I saved them as much as $30,000 at a throw. In hospital cases where they're being charged when they shouldn't have been charged, especially hospital. And I found that this was very satisfying me to give back to the community, not just to take, but to give back. I've also enjoyed singing. I'm a bass. My wife is an alto. I also enjoy drama, and I belong to a drama club. And we do comical stuff, because I'm supposed to be the funny guy. But overall, I can say in closing that life has been very good. I bless this country, and I bless all the people in this country for having saved me. And to close, I say, to save a life is to save the world. Thank you. Anybody that wishes to ask a question, I'm certainly welcome.
Please raise your hand.
Especially when it comes to subjects that are more personal, I'm willing to talk about that too. Yes?
Yes, sir.
What is your wife's name?
Her name is Glenda. Glenda Phyllis Beller, otherwise known as the Sweet Girl.
Your name is Lava. Lava.
Right.
Yes. Do you have any siblings?
You mean brothers or sisters? No. Because of the war and because of all the tragedies that occurred, it wasn't possible for my mother to have. I thought I'd add something in addition which I did not cover, which is actually very tragic. It has to do with my father's family in Poland. My family in Austria, including relatives, were able to leave under very hard circumstances, but they were able to leave. The ones in Poland did not. They were not survivors. My father's family, which included mostly women and a few men, were working on a farm, chicken farm, in a relatively low-income life. But they were managing as best they could. But when the Germans took over Poland, immediately they were on a campaign of massacre, either death camps or otherwise. In this case, it was otherwise. They sent out a number of people on motorcycles with machine guns. They called them the Einsatzgruppen, which meant basically the ones that were going to do the job for the Nazi cause. They came out, took all the people from the community and lined them up against an open area. They made them dig their own graves. All of them. Machine guns, every one of them. Children, women, children, no questions. The last guy who was not machine gunned had to close up all the graves. He had to shovel them closed, and then he himself was machine gunned. That was an example of the courtesy of the Nazi regime. I didn't want to leave that out, and I haven't mentioned it before, but I thought I'd just give you an example of the ultimate ugliness that this world has to offer. And now you see lots of it in the Ukraine too, which I don't want to go into, but this business about never again doesn't work, because we've seen it in too many parts of the world, too many times, and now in Ukraine we're seeing it again where civilians are being slaughtered and raped. So never again is a term to make you feel good, but it doesn't necessarily happen. Okay, I wanted to continue the question. Yes?
So first of all, thank you for speaking. I have two questions. The first is if you wouldn't mind just sharing some of maybe the experiences you heard about the concentration camps from people you knew, just to sort of get that picture of what happened for.
You're talking now about what happened at the death camps? Is that what you're saying?
Mhm. And then, to go with that, how would you feel is the best way to teach children about what's going on with the Holocaust, passing the story down to making sure that it doesn't happen again? Because I think that's really important.
To be honest with you, without meaning to be negative, it happens again every time you turn around in this world. I mean, we can't control the world. We can only control our own lives, and possibly our own country. But what you can see currently, not just in Ukraine, but in a number of areas, including Africa and the Sudan, and a lot of other areas where people are being taken because they belong to the wrong party or the wrong tribe or whatever, and being slaughtered for no reason whatsoever. So there is really no direct answer that I can give you about never again. I can only tell you that in the camps themselves, conditions were horrendous. People were being worked to death and not being fed properly until they starved. And in some cases, they were immediately sent to the death camp and killed. As soon as they came in, they were lined up, and they went into the gas chamber, and then they went into the ovens. Just to give you an example of how close you can feel, I'm talking about myself now. I saw a movie, I think it was called Schindler's List. When the people went into this place and they thought they were going to be gassed to death. And they weren't. It was a shower for a change. And I felt like I was there. I felt that I was going to be killed as I was watching the movie. I was afraid that this was my end. It was so real and so horrendous that you actually felt that you were there. And I'll never forget that. And Schindler's List was, without a doubt, one of the great movies ever done. And even the guy who played the Nazi officer, Ralph Fiennes, is a great actor. Because to play the bad role that bad and that well takes talent. Because it's not the guy who's bad, it's the subject itself.
I wanted to just, thank you, and I think it's important for, as much as you don't want to hear the graphic details of what happened, for people to hear the details of what happened to a lot of these people, because otherwise it doesn't get passed down, and I think it's a really important lesson for people to understand.
And any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little louder? Oh, yes. Actually, we went back a number of times. On vacation a couple of times to Vienna, just on part of a trip, and once the government invited me back. They invited me and my wife back, and they paid all the expenses. And I even met the president of Austria. A number of other Holocaust survivors also came at the same time from Vienna. And we were treated very nicely. We were given a lot of comforts and shown some of the highlights of Vienna, which of course is one of the great cities of the world. And we enjoyed it. And the Austrians are trying to show that they care. They have a lot of street blocks with names of people who were killed, names and dates of extermination, and showing a certain amount of guilt on their part, because the Austrians were just as guilty as the Germans. Because when Hitler came into Vienna, he was greeted like the big hero. And in that documentary, you see all the Heil Hitlers, you see him waving and holding a baby in his hands. The same kind of baby he would have slaughtered if it was a Jew. So that is the story on that, yeah. Yes, sir?
A couple of questions, if I may. I write for the local newspaper at the Roswell community, so a couple of these things are going to get in there. When you went back to Vienna, were you able to, was your old home still standing?
Yes, we went back to the apartment where I lived on Stumpergasse, which happened to be a street off one of the main roads, which was like a Broadway. The main road was called Marianne.
Was somebody living in the apartment?
Oh, yes. Even though we didn't see them, but we did visit the house itself, and we didn't go upstairs or anything, but we went to the house and the backyard.
Okay.
And we talked a little, and the picture shows us walking through on that. They did a 10-minute documentary on it, returning to Vienna, and it included going back to the house where I was born.
The couple from Philadelphia
Yeah.
sponsored the 50 children.
Right.
Their names,
Kraus.
Ralph?
Mr. and Mrs. Kraus. Kraus. They took 2 children themselves, which they took care of for a period of time. I don't recall their names, but they also took 2 children.
And then when you were there, you were placed with a family.
I was placed with a family, Mr. and Mrs. Philip Amram, yeah. And her name was Emily, the lady.
Philip?
Philip Werner Amram, A-M-R-A-M. And her name was Emily.
And lastly, how did you feel about going back to Vienna after being away all these years?
Well, an interesting question, and my answer is such that quite a few people, including my mother, would not agree with me. I don't believe in permanent guilt. I mean, some people say, oh, they're all Nazis anyway, so the war's over, and now they're independent, but they still hate us, and they're still anti-Semites, and they're this and that. I personally felt somewhat different. The Austrian government has been as supportive of Israel as any country in the United States, as any place in the world. The same goes for Germany. I don't believe in permanent guilt, even though some people do, and my mother certainly did. She said, once an anti-Semite, always an anti-Semite. And maybe she's right, maybe I'm wrong. But I accepted them as human beings who were trying to make up for tragic times. And they treated me with kindness and with respect. And as a result, I felt I didn't feel like I was in enemy territory or anything like that.
From Germany?
A Holocaust survivor is here today. His name is Saul Laurie, and he would like to come up and say a few words.
My name is Saul Laurie. I'm a Holocaust survivor. I'm a survivor of 6 concentration camps. Okay? I was in Auschwitz, Kaufenau, Landsberg, Dachau, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Buchenwald. I tell you, when I go back to Germany, I feel like a giant. Okay? Because when I look at the Germans, and I said, you wanted to annihilate this little Jew. Here I'm back as American. As a matter of fact, in the Korean War, I volunteered for the army. And guess where they sent me? To Germany. But this time I came back an American soldier, a conqueror. And when I looked at, and I became an American citizen in the army, you know where? Guess where? Berlin. Okay? I became an American citizen in 1952. I mean, I'm the proudest American you're gonna find. Anybody talks about it. Because this is the greatest country in the world. And God bless America. And people should learn to appreciate it more. And when I look at it, and even now, when I look at the Germans, it's actually I was supposed to be there now, but my back is bothering me. I was supposed to be there. For my birthday, the German government invited me. I was liberated on my birthday. I was born April 11, 1930. I was liberated on April 11, 1945. I was 15 years old. I still feel like a young boy. But God bless America, though. There's no greater country in the world. And when I go to Germany, I tell you, it's unbelievable the way they treat us. You know what hotel they put me in? And I go, Hitler's famous hotel where Hitler used to stay. That's the hotel I stay in. Okay? And I'm proud of it. And I can't blame the new generation for the old generation. I know when I go back to Germany, they treat me like royalty. No? The most important thing I believe in my life is to treat people the way I want to be treated, with love. People are hungry, I feed them. People need help, I help them. People know that. Even now, people sitting here, they know who I am. And God bless America. Okay? And whatever we need, we have to do to fight what's going on in this world. And that's it.
Before I begin, I want to invite the entire audience to Etz Chaim this Friday. The students at the Hebrew School are going to do a program called Voices of the Holocaust, where they will be reading short paragraphs about survivors from Monroe. The poem I'm about to read is called 6 Million Tears. It was written, can you hear me? It was written by the late Ted Kartzman, who was a Monroe resident and a member of the Henry Rickless Memorial Holocaust Committee, which will be back in operation next year. Yay! 6 million tears. 6 million tears. 6 million cries for help. 6 million cries for mercy. 6 million cries to save humanity. 6 million cries to save the world. 6 million tears. 6 million tears that saturated the barren, blood-soaked earth of Europe, and the world reacted with stone-faced silence and feigned ignorance. There would be no help. There would be no salvation. There would be no rescue, only death. 6 million deaths. 6 million deaths. 6 million murders. 1.5 million children. All Jews must die. All Jews must die because they are Jews. All Jews must die because they are Jews. All Jews must die. 6 candles. 6 candles for 6 million. 6 candles for 6 million souls. 6 million lights to illuminate the conspiratorial silence and the blighted darkness. 6 candles to tell the world that we have not, nor will we ever forget. 6 candles for 6 million tears. Yes, 6 million tears. Thank you.